We're going to finish the chapter on law, and we're going to start with Marxism. Oh boy, oh boy. I'm going to turn you sideways. There we go. Cool. All right. Section 5. To the Marxists, the idea of law based on God's revelation is nothing more than a means of controlling the workers and preventing society's evolution toward communism. Lenin said, "In what sense do we repudiate ethics and morality? In the sense in which it was preached by the bourgeoisie who derived ethics from God's commandments. We, of course, say that we do not believe in God." Since Marx did not believe in God, it was inconceivable that laws would be based on his will. Rather, they were based on the will of the bourgeoisie. Your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeoisie production and bourgeoisie property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into a law for all. L.S. Jawitz. That's a fun name. A modern-day Marxist legal theorist maintained Lenin's denial of anything supernatural, saying there are no eternal, immutable principles of law. But Marxists go further. Law is only necessary because economic classes exist and come into conflict with one another. Engels said, "In order that these classes with conflicting economic interests may not annihilate themselves and society in a useless struggle, a power becomes necessary that stands apparently above society and has the function of keeping down the conflicts and maintaining order. And this power, the outgrowth of society, but assuming supremacy over it and becoming more and more divorced from it, is the state." Lenin affirmed this thinking. The state is an organ of class domination, an organ of oppression of one class by another. Laws are thus imposed by the state to quell these disturbances. The Marxist reasons that if economic classes cease to exist because the proletariat, the working class, has triumphed over the bourgeoisie, the property owners, then no law or government will really be necessary. In the short run, new socialist laws will need to be devised to remove the exploitation built into bourgeoisie law. But this will pass away. According to Jawitz, an anti-exploiter tendency is what characterizes the special features of all the principles of the law of socialist society in its most concentrated form. This new system of law, it is supposed, will be built around the needs of the workers and farmers. Howard Selsom explained, "Marxism, which has been so often accused of seeking to eliminate moral considerations from human life and history, emphasizes rather the moral issues involved in every situation. It does so, however, not by standing on a false platform of absolute right, but by identifying itself with the real needs and interests of the workers and farmers." Such a system of law must be flexible because the needs of the workers and farmers may change through time. E.B. Pashukanis, I like the second way, Pashukanis wrote, "We require that our legislation possess maximum elasticity. We cannot fetter ourselves by any sort of system. The courts must be structured with the same goals." Jawitz described law in a Marxist society this way. As a component of the legal superstructure, law is closely linked with the political superstructure and with the state. Lenin agreed, saying, "A court is an organ of state power. Liberals sometimes forget that. It is a sin for Marxists to forget it. Courts must be reoriented to remove the vestiges of bourgeoisie law by any means, including authorizing violence." Lenin said boldly, "The revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat is won and maintained by the use of violence, by the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, rule that is unrestricted by any laws. No restrictions on this power will be tolerated. Given these assumptions, it is easy to see why Marxists are not interested in Western ideas about human rights. According to proletariat law, only the working class is capable of deciding the laws, because only they have the necessary class consciousness. Of course, not every person in the working class can make these decisions, so the Communist Party takes on that responsibility on their behalf. Andriy Vishenke explained, there might be collisions and discrepancies between the formal commands of laws and those of the proletarian revolution. This collision must be solved only by the subordination of the formal commands of law to those of party policy. This is a fancy way of saying, as the pig said in Animal Farm, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. There's a typo there, sorry. Of course, Marxist theorists insist this kind of brute force is made necessary only because of capitalism. Once society has been thoroughly disinfected, all people will create and live in an environment that promotes harmony, and the need for law will dissolve. Criminal activity will be practically non-existent, Marxists claim, and the causes of antisocial activity, injustice, and inequality will cease to exist. John Plamenatz said that in a communist society, crime will be virtually unknown because motives will be less urgent and frequent, and the offender will be more easily brought to his senses by the need to regain the good opinion of his neighbors. The fact that no such society has ever materialized fails to discourage Marxists even today. Their faith in their underlying assumptions is so complete they think it must be true. If we haven't seen it yet, it is because of the ongoing power of capitalism and the refusal of current legislatures and courts to destroy it. But ideas have consequences. A view that fails to acknowledge the dignity of humans as God's image bearers, or the source of law as God's nature and character, will have a devastating impact on society. If the ideas of Lenin, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, and other Marxist dictators are any indication, the consequence is one of body count. Marxist governments have managed to kill on purpose more human beings than any other worldview in history. And I'm sorry I don't know how to say that guy's name. I should look it up. Mao. We'll just call him Mao. He's a Chinese guy. But I should learn. I'll look it up. 6. Postmodernism. When Sonia Sotomayor was nominated as United States Supreme Court Justice, a line from a speech she had given at the University of California, Berkeley, became the target of scrutiny. I would hope, she said, that a wise Latina woman, with the richness of her experiences, would more often than not reach a better conclusion than a white male who hasn't lived that life. Why would a different race entail different understandings of wisdom? It sounds like a denial of absolute truth. President Obama, who had nominated her, took to the television cameras to allay people's concerns. She was quickly confirmed and she joined the court. However, a closer look at the entire speech, called A Latino Judge's Voice, reveals that critics of her judicial philosophy had not taken the quote out of context, as the American people were told. In her speech, Sotomayor approvingly quoted Harvard Law School professor Martha Minow, who said, "There is no objective stance, but only a series of perspectives. No neutrality, no escape from choice in judging." If Justice Sotomayor thinks law cannot be neutral, that there is no basis for how one applies the law, then what foundation is there for any true understanding of law and justice? A graduate of one of Summit Ministries' 12-day leadership schools was able to pose this precise question as a U.S. Senate staffer attending a lecture by Justice Sotomayor. Justice Sotomayor, what should be the foundation for understanding and applying justice in America? After an extended moment of silence, Sotomayor replied, "I don't think I've ever considered that question in that form before." After another moment of silence, she concluded, "I suppose for me it would be the inherent dignity of all people, but I'm not sure what it would be for anyone else." Setting aside the question of how a Supreme Court Justice of the United States might have never considered the foundations of justice, Sotomayor's answer betrays something of the postmodern view of law. What might be a foundation for one person might not be a foundation for anyone else. If law has no essential nature, if there is no essential moral truth, what does it mean to speak of people's inherent value? Are empirical data, objective knowledge, objective facts, and claimed of justice nothing more than tricks people in power perform to make everyone else see them as right? It's not that postmodernists don't want justice. It's that they view anything resulting from the power structures of Christianity and the Enlightenment as unjust. Therefore, the postmodern understanding of justice in relation to the law is not actually connected to any objective standards. Rather, it is the process of uncovering the various forms of oppression. I'm going to shut my door and be right back. Okie dokie. As Daniel Farber and Susanna Sherry argue, postmodernists attack the concepts of reason and objective truth, condemning them as components of white male domination. They prefer more subjective ways of knowing, supposedly favored by women and minorities, such as storytelling. As to the rule of law, it is an article of postmodern faith that legal rules are indeterminate and serve only to disguise the law's white male bias. For this reason, postmodernists are bent on sniffing out and destroying religious roots and transcendent qualities from Western law. They embrace the fragmentation and subjectivity of law because it puts the spotlight on social justice and helps create left-wing political change. But if there's no such thing as true justice, what merit is there to postmodernist complaints about injustice? Figuring out the postmodernist answer to that question requires us to consider ideas well outside the normal bounds of legal thought. Postmodernism in law forms a frontal assault on traditional Western law. Leading the attack is the critical legal studies movement, which for 30 years or so has focused on publishing critiques of law, focused on progressive, even radical political change rather than an efficient government. In fact, the CLS, or Critical Legal Studies, slogan is "Critique is all there is." As we saw in the chapter on postmodernism, this way of thinking is based on the work of Jacques Derrida, who tried to show how texts of all kinds could be deconstructed to reveal their hidden meanings. Legal scholars use Derrida's techniques to dissect laws to discover how they create or contribute to unequal power relations. Postmodernists take social constructionism, the secularist view of sociology, a step further. If reality is socially constructed, and if we feel oppressed, then those who did the constructing have probably constructed reality to secure their own power. This is known as hegemony. Just as Foucault saw all relationships between people as power relationships, postmodernists assert that objective knowledge is, as Farber and Sherry describe, a power relation, one category of people benefiting at the expense of another category of people. Farber and Sherry quote one feminist as saying, "Feminist analysis begins with the principle that objective reality is myth." Universal standards of legal judgment, common to all, do not exist. Therefore, any view of law a feminist thinks enshrines patriarchy is in, I can read. Therefore, any view of law a feminist thinks enshrines patriarchy is invalid on its face. And just remember, patriarchy comes from patriarchal, which was the whole father, that all laws and rules were made up by men. It's the patriarchal system, the father system. So not that fathers are bad, it's just comes from that. And that started in the Bible. So it's, yeah. So what do you do if you think the law is being used improperly to enshrine a meta-narrative with which you disagree? If others have used the law to illegitimately gain power, postmodernists don't feel bad about using the law to get it back. There is no objective means of knowing truth, no objective concept of justice, only politics. As Stanley Fish, professor of law and English, admits, the name of the game has always been politics. In the same speech cited earlier, Sotomayor said, I accept the proposition that, as Judge Resnick describes it, to judge is an exercise of power. So let's see if we've got this. Objective reasoning is bad, and law is not about justice, but about political power. If these statements are accurate, why should we listen to postmodernists? They're just as biased as anyone else. Recognizing this problem, some postmodernists have decided to stop trying to make logical arguments to appeal to the mind and start telling stories that appeal to the heart. Farber and Sherry explain, because the scholarship of women and people of color reflects their distinctive knowledge gained from listening to and telling stories. The radical multiculturalists argue it cannot be judged or tested by traditional standards. Instead, they imply it should be judged according to its political effect. It should be judged in terms of its ability to advance the interests of the outsider community, because outsider scholarship is often aimed not at understanding law, but at changing it. If this idea of changing the law rather than understanding it sounds familiar, it's because it is. This is how Marx viewed the academic disciplines. We should harness them to change the world in our image. The change postmodernists pursue is not aimed toward any stable sense of justice. Rather, it is driven by a sense of inevitable justice. As a case in point, here's Justice Sotomayor's questionable quotation in its full context. Justice O'Connor has often been cited as saying that a wise old man and wise old woman will reach the same conclusion in deciding cases. I'm not so sure Justice O'Connor is the author of that line. I'm also not so sure that I agree with the statement. First, as Professor Martha Minow has noted, there can never be a universal definition of wise. Second, I would hope that a wise Latina woman, with the richness of her experiences, would more often than not reach a better conclusion than a white male who hasn't lived that life. To postmodernists, this makes perfect sense. Law isn't based on any objective truth. It's just the perspective a person brings to a situation. Justice Sotomayor thinks this would lead to better decisions, but couldn't it just as well lead to worse ones? In 2006, a part-time stripper named Crystal Gail Mangum accused 3 members of the Duke University lacrosse team of rape. After a thorough and very public examination of the evidence, all charges were dropped, and the students were proclaimed innocent. Prosecuting attorney Mike Nifong lost his law license because of several ethical violations. During the process, a group of 88 Duke University professors signed an advertisement in a Duke newspaper implying that the charges were true. Forsaking the principle of innocent until proven guilty, one of the professors behind the advertisement, Wanima Lubiano, called the lacrosse players almost perfect defenders and exemplars of the upper end of the class hierarchy, the politically dominant race and ethnicity, the dominant gender, the dominant sexuality, and the dominant social group on campus, and promised to pursue the issue regardless of the truth established and whatever happens with the court case. So just in case you got lost in all the words, a stripper accused 3 members of the lacrosse team of rape, and 88 professors at the college took out an advertisement in a newspaper and said, whatever the courts find, we don't care. We believe that they're guilty because they're white males, the dominant race, they're the dominant gender, they're the dominant example of rich people, so they must be the oppressors and they must be taken out. In the mind of Lubiano, the story Magnum told was true, even though it didn't accord with the facts, because it nonetheless fit Lubiano's conception of how the world is. Lubiano's actions, along with the other 87 professors who joined her crusade, created an emotional backlash against the lacrosse players. One professor even flunked two of the players without justification, a decision she reversed only when a court decision forced her to do so. The lives of many people were upended and many reputations were besmirched. Much injustice was done in the service of a story that rang true for people who could imagine, as had happened in history, a powerless young black woman being mistreated by powerful white men. I'm going to stop here for a second, though, and say those boys made a stupid decision. Regardless of what happened and regardless of how it all went down, they made a bad decision and there were consequences, and these are some of them. These consequences are unjust. Farber and Sherry illustrate how this shift influences legal theory. Rather than relying solely on legal or interdisciplinary authorities, empirical data, or rigorous analysis, legal scholars have begun to offer stories often about their own real or imagined experiences. If logic and dispassionate reasoning are tools of white male bias, then stories confirming this must be true, whether they are factual or not. Trial lawyer Gary Salmon predicts the results of a postmodern focus on racial, gender, and cultural politics becoming an integral part of the legal system. Postmodern legal theory trickles down to breed cynicism toward all government and the entire criminal justice system. I'm going to add, and it makes everybody mad. Sound familiar? This, then, is the real issue. No one questions the fact that law requires interpretation or that judges or juries may have acted unfairly, sometimes based on race or gender bias. The question is this: how do we view such unfairness? Do we accept that all people must inevitably be unfair and subjective, as postmodernists claim? Or do we recognize such unfairness as the evil it is and resist it? When we accept what postmodernism preaches, we lose all basis for calling the system to fairness. We instead challenge minority populations to pursue power so they can take their turn. Salmon's point is worth taking seriously. Yes, injustice exists, but which response is the better remedy? To search for true justice or to cynically abandon the idea of justice altogether? Postmodernists say they speak for the dispossessed, but by their own admission, they are merely trying to grab the reins of power from the hands of others. If what they say about the powerlessness of minorities and women is true, though, this is a risky strategy. It is precarious to advocate the use of raw power when you are not the one who possesses it. In the end, postmodernism depends for its success on whether people who actually believe in justice are touched by its stories of injustice. We are not aware of any other worldview like this, which depends for its success on the goodwill of those whose sensibilities have been refined by their thoroughgoing rejection of its underlying assumptions. 7. New spirituality. New spiritualists do not spend much energy discussing law, justice, and judgment. They prefer instead to concentrate on personal inner development, getting in touch with the God within. As Marianne Williamson says, as extensions of God, we are ourselves the spirit of compassion, and in our right minds, we don't seek to judge, but to heal. The unwillingness of new spiritualists to develop a coherent theory of law, though, carries great implications for all of society. If each of us is a God, we can decide the legality of an action only by getting in touch with our inner gods. Each of us is his or her own legal authority, and any manifestation of outside authority hinders our communication with our godhood. Shakti Gawain explains, the real problem with commitment to an external form is that it doesn't allow room for the inevitable changes and growth of people and relationships. If you promise to feel or behave by a certain set of rules, eventually you're going to have to choose between being true to yourself and being true to those rules. If we choose to honor a set of rules other than inner truth, we sacrifice our godhood. Gawain reiterates what happens when we look to authority outside ourselves. When we consistently suppress and distrust our intuitive knowingness, looking instead for external authority, validation, and approval from others, we give our personal power away. New spiritualists then focus on their own power, authority, and rules as they pursue higher consciousness. Gawain explains, as each of us connects with our inner spiritual awareness, we learn that the creative power of the universe is within us. We also learn that we can create our own reality and take responsibility for doing so. We struggle with what to call this because it is more of a form of personal empowerment than a concept of law. Perhaps we should call it self-law. It does not say that the law is in our hearts, but that there is no law except that which is in our hearts. Anything hindering our search for higher consciousness is bad. David Spangler, through the voice of what he claimed was a channeled spirit, said, "Their world of darkness is under the law and shall disappear." Having an inadequate concept of law makes it difficult for new spiritualists to grapple with difficult realities like crime. According to Kevin Ryerson, mankind in all life is basically good. People who commit crimes are guilty not of violating a standard of justice, but of succumbing to the pain experienced by falling short in their quest for higher consciousness. Eckhart Tolle seems to even relish this kind of legal defense. To my knowledge so far, no defense lawyer has said to the judge, although the day may not be far off, "This is a case of diminished responsibility. My client's pain body was activated, and he did not know what he was doing. In fact, he didn't do it. His pain body did." In the new spiritualist worldview, achieving higher consciousness is the most important thing. Mark Satin says getting in touch with ourselves would appear to be not just fun, though it can be that, and not self-indulgence at all, but an imperative for survival that's built right into the structure of the universe, maybe even an evolutionary imperative. Joseph Campbell agreed, saying, "I always tell my students to go where your body and soul want to go. When you have the feeling, then stay with it and don't let anyone throw you off." People should follow their bliss, according to Campbell. What implications follow the application of this to law and justice? New spiritualists aren't worried. The search for higher consciousness goes on. Islam. Freedom House, a nonprofit organization cataloging the state of freedom in the world's nations, rejoiced in its 2013 report that despite an overall decrease in freedom in the world, at least one Muslim-dominated nation, Egypt, was freer after its revolution than before. The researchers at Freedom House, though, have missed one of the most significant aspects of this revolution. The president of Egypt at the time of their report, Mohammed Morsi, is a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, a group deeply committed to Islamizing the world. In a presidential address, Morsi led the crowd in a call and response. He said, "The Quran is our constitution." The crowd said the same. Morsi said, "The Prophet Muhammad is our leader." The crowd repeats it. Morsi, "Jihad is our path." The crowd repeats. Morsi says, "And death for the sake of Allah is our most lofty aspiration." The crowd repeats it. Morsi says, "Above all, Allah is our goal." Morsi followed this chant with a pledge to aggressively implement Sharia law. The Sharia, then the Sharia, and finally the Sharia. This nation will enjoy blessing and revival only through the Islamic Sharia. The Sharia. And yeah. At the time of this writing, Morsi has been deposed in a military coup. But that someone with Morsi's beliefs could take over such an influential nation is unsettling, to say the least. Western observers cannot understand the incredible implications of this speech without an understanding of Islam's highly developed and detailed legal tradition. Unlike the Christian worldview, Islam teaches that God reveals only his law, not himself. The body of laws based on this revelation, Sharia, is seen as divine law, co-eternal with God. Indeed, the Sharia itself is considered to be a timeless manifestation of the will of God, subject neither to history nor circumstance. The goal of Muslim jurists, according to journalist and Islam expert Melis Ruthven, is not law-making, but fiqh, understanding or knowledge of a law deemed to exist already. Understanding Sharia law involves a thorough study of four sources: the Quran, the Sunnah, the Ijma, and Qiyas. It specifies 5 categories of law: acts that are commanded, acts that are forbidden, acts that are disapproved, recommended, and indifferent. For legal scholar Hava Jiguni Rubenacker, that's quite a name, Sharia law is primarily for the purpose of protecting human life, human reason, offspring, right to property, and freedom of speech. So sounds really good. But when the provisions of Sharia are taken together, most Westerners would be horrified. Killing of homosexuals, adulterers, apostates, or people who leave Islam, and blasphemers, anyone who says anything negative about Allah or the Prophet Muhammad. Marital rape is condoned, amputation of limbs for theft is commanded, and whipping. Selling into slavery and oppressing non-converts is demanded, as is the non-negotiable duty of war against infidels. What impact does this law have on America? Journalist Paul Williams, an unabashed secularist, is deeply alarmed. If Islam continues to grow at its present rate, critical mass will be achieved by 2020, and the eventual Muslim transformation of America will become a statistical possibility. This is not to say that Sharia will be the law of the land, but it is to affirm that the religion of the Prophet will be a force that cannot be denied by our elected officials. Demands will be met, concessions granted. A Muslim Brotherhood strategy document discovered, translated, and entered into the transcript of a 2007 trial of leaders of the Holy Land Foundation for supporting a foreign terrorist organization supported Williams' concerns. This document read in part, "The process of settlement is a civilization jihadist process, with all the word means. The Ikhwan, or Islamic Religious Militia, must understand that their work in America is a kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying the Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hands and the hands of the believers, so that it is eliminated and God's religion is made victorious over all other religions." Whether the Muslim Brotherhood has the resources to carry out this mission, and whether the American people have the political will to resist it, remains to be seen. The greatest concern Sharia law critics express is the inevitability of human rights violations, the destruction of due process, and the corruption of those nations following it. Lord Acton coined the now famous phrase, "Power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely." Humans should not be trusted with too much power. In the United States, this has led to distribution of power among the branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. This division balances power and checks its abuse. Islam, as we have seen earlier in this volume, does not share the sin nature view. Ruthven says, because the Islamist model is predicated on the belief in government by morally impeccable individuals who can be counted on to resist temptation, it does not generate institutions capable of functioning autonomously by means of structural checks and balances. Political institutions function only as a result of the virtue of those who run them, but virtue can become widespread only if society is already Islamic. Muslims do not share the view that leaders inherently tend toward corruption, and thus they are much more willing to abide authoritarian government. No wonder nations with a predominantly Muslim population tend toward dictatorship or monarchy. In its report, Freedom in the World 2013, Freedom House listed 47 nations that received a rating of not free. Of the countries in the Middle East and North Africa, most of which have Muslim governments and largely Muslim populations, only 22% were free and 66% were not free. In Saudi Arabia, churches are prohibited from being built. Christians must worship in the privacy of their own homes and refrain from even praying out loud so that faithful Muslims can remain untainted by Christianity. In Algeria, a law passed in 2005 pronounced as criminal any means of enticing a Muslim to another religion, including even producing, storing, or distributing printed documents or audiovisual formats or any other format or means which seeks to shake the faith of a Muslim. So far, opposition to Islamic law's growth is limited. Sharia law is spreading rapidly, and people seem incapable of speaking up against it. This may be changing. In 2011, a group of reform-minded Muslims issued a statement that read in part, "Like all totalitarianisms, Islamism is nurtured by fears and frustrations. The preachers of hate bet on these feelings in order to form battalions destined to impose a world of inequality. But we clearly and firmly state, nothing, not even despair, justifies the choice of obscurantism, totalitarianism, and hatred." Whether this call to action will be heeded or whether it is too little too late cannot be known at the present time. Much depends on how proponents of democratic freedom respond. Even a casual look at Freedom House's map of freedom reveals an undeniable link between freedom and worldview. Against the Muslim tendency toward totalitarianism, the nations with the highest regard for basic human rights and the rule of law are those influenced most by Christianity. Law cannot be discussed in isolation from other aspects of a worldview. In order to retain personal freedoms within a society, a legal system must have a sustainable foundation. Ideas have consequences. Christianity. Christians believe that God gave us divine laws and the means of discovering them. Carl F. H. Henry says, "God is the only legislator. Earthly rulers and legislative bodies are alike accountable to him from whom stems all obligation, religious, ethical, and civil." This is in 2 Chronicles 20 and Acts 17. You may be thinking, now wait a minute, you just criticized Islamic law by saying that its supposed divine inspiration from God is what makes it so scary. Now you're saying that Christian law is divinely inspired? What's the difference? The issue is not one of divine inspiration, but of the nature and character of that divinity and the revelation proceeding from it. As Russell Kirk said, to cut off law from its ethical sources is to strike a terrible blow at the rule of law. Our premise in this section of the chapter will be as follows. Christians, in acknowledging humans as image bearers of God, but also taking into account human fallenness, have created a system of justice that, while imperfect, has provided for greater order and justice than any other system. We will examine this claim by discussing the basic precepts of Christian law, a Christian view of natural law, and the implications of applying a biblical view to society. Christian law consists of 6 basic precepts. The source of all divine law is the character and nature of God. Francis Schaeffer said, "God has a character, and his character is the law of the universe. Not all things are the same to God. Some things conform to his character, and some do not." 2. The moral order proceeds from and reflects the character of God, his holiness, justice, truth, love, and mercy. God's moral order is as real as the physical order. 3. We are created in God's image and thus are significant. Our lives are not afterthoughts or accidents. God established human government to protect human life, rights, and dignity. 4. We humans possess a nature that is in rebellion against God, and thus we need to turn from our vain ways. Because of this aspect of our nature, we must have restraint and accountability. 5. God the Creator became God the Redeemer by taking on the very human form he had created. And 6. God will judge the whole human race through Christ, according to his standard of good and evil. To the Christian, these precepts form a moral law that is as true as the law of gravity. People who ignore or deny the law of gravity by jumping off a tall building don't violate the law, they prove it. In the same way, ignoring or denying the prohibition against murder or theft has severe consequences for citizenry. People become discouraged, afraid, and unmotivated when justice is thrown off kilter and not set right again. To quote John Whitehead, when fundamental principles of law are undermined, public confidence in law and public willingness to abide by law are also sapped. So, where should we turn to understand law? Once again, the concepts of general and special revelation come into play not only as the basis for our understanding of God, but also for our understanding of human law. The bankruptcy of the world's legal and ethical codes demonstrates the need for a legal system based outside human interest. John Warwick Montgomery wrote, "The horrors of our recent history have forced us to recognize the puerile inadequacy of tying ultimate legal standards to the mores of a particular society, even if that society is our own." General revelation and natural law. Let's begin with general revelation. God's general revelation to us is of both a physical and a moral character. We know this revelation through our consciences, which provide an innate sense of right and wrong. The Apostle Paul said, when Gentiles, who do not have the law, by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. Romans 1 and 2 implies that all humans know a higher law exists, even if they fail to obey it. In our fallen, sinful nature, we reveal that we have an understanding of what is right. Though we can't see through a glass darkly, still we see. We know intuitively that certain things cut against the moral order: sexual brokenness, rebellion, spitefulness, pride, boasting, disobedience, covenant breaking, and brutality. William Blackstone, one of the most influential figures in the history of law, described the Christian view of natural law this way: man, considered as a creature, must necessarily be subject to the law of his creator, for he is an entirely dependent being, and consequently, as man depends absolutely upon his maker for everything, it is necessary that he should, in all points, conform to his maker's will. This will of his maker is called the law of nature. Blackstone's view is consistent with the biblical account of creation, moral order, and divine law. So, general revelation gives you moral law. So remember, general revelation is what you can see with your eyes. It does not lead to salvation, but everything that you can see it, and it involves your consciousness, which is a spiritual aspect of your being. General revelation, I hope, just got a little bit bigger to you. Special revelation and divine law. In addition to natural law, Christian legal theory must take into account God's special revelation of his moral order and divine law, the Bible. Natural law gives us a general concept of right and wrong. The Bible fleshes out that skeletal framework, telling us what God considers moral and lawful. In the biblical account, when God brought the nation of Israel out of Egypt, he clearly told them not to follow the legal structures either of Egypt, where they had been, or of Canaan, where they were going. Instead, he set Israel apart with its own set of laws. There seem to have been three kinds of laws in ancient Israel. Some were moral laws, prohibitions against incest, adultery, sodomy, and bestiality. There were ceremonial laws, laws prohibiting eating certain kinds of foods or wearing certain kinds of clothes, and judicial laws. Those were laws against theft or lying in economic transactions. Some of these laws seem to have been specific to their particular situation, and the reasons for them are lost to us today. As an example, imagine archaeologists 2,000 years in the future puzzling over why why our society considered it illegal to drive on the left side of the road. Other laws, though, were based on realities about human design, the nature of the world, and what it takes to establish and sustain honorable homes and communities. Throughout history, Christians have seen the Bible as the only true source for discovering the nature of rights and justice, without which we will have misery. Noah Webster put it this way: the moral principles and precepts contained in the Scriptures ought to form the basis of all our civil constitutions and laws. All the miseries and evils which men suffer from vice, crime, ambition, injustice, oppression, slavery, and war proceed from their despising or neglecting the precepts contained in the Bible. For Webster, if we fail to heed divine law, nothing else we do will matter. As there is a God in heaven who exercises a moral government over the affairs of this world, so certainly will the neglect of the divine command in the choice of rulers be followed by bad laws and a bad administration. By laws unjust or partial, by corruption, tyranny, impunity of crimes, waste of public money, and 1,000 other evils. Men may devise and adopt new forms of government. They may amend old forms, repair breaches, and punish violators of the Constitution. There can be no effectual remedy but obedience to the divine law. America's Declaration of Independence was crafted on the understanding that Webster articulated. Thomas Jefferson, even though he was a deist, said this: God, who gave us life, gave us liberty. And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. Though Jefferson denied much of biblical revelation, he grasped enough of God's nature to recognize that if liberty is something humans give, then humans can take it away. It is either inalienable or impotent. Because of the importance of self-government to just laws, the Christian tradition not only weighs in on what we have the right to do to others and to expect from them, but also what we have the right to do to ourselves. Gary Amos says men have rights, such as the right to life. But because a man has a duty to live his life for God, the right is unalienable. He can defend his life against all others, but not destroy it himself. No man has the right to harm himself, to commit suicide, or to waste his life. Other worldviews, such as Marxism, are utopian in that they insist on the absolute elimination of the Marxist view of sin, capitalism, before society will function properly. As long as any vestige of capitalism remains, Marxists will refuse to take any responsibility for the consequences of their actions. From a Christian viewpoint, utopian visions are nothing more than mere fantasies, because the law cannot make everything turn out the way we want. We are made in God's image, but we are fallen. Our natures are corrupted by sin. No legal system can cause every person to always act morally. The best we can do is develop systems of accountability that make order and justice more likely than not. It should also be said that the goal of Christian law is not to force people to convert to Christianity, but to stabilize society by ensuring that the innocent are protected and the guilty are punished. This is what God requires of us, to act justly and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. As justice rises, however, the law can shine light on God's law and how our longing for mercy and grace might be fulfilled. When society is just, people have a big view of God. When society is unjust, people have a small view of God. We've hinted throughout this chapter at something most people find patently obvious, but that must be carefully explored. God's laws don't just happen. They're the result of careful deliberation on the part of people who have society's best interests at heart. How this happens is something people in the domain of politics have studied for centuries. In the next chapter, we'll turn our attention toward the political realm to see if we can get beyond the stereotypes of politicians to discern how to best use power to organize community. The end.